desktop and laptop with virtualization. You get to run more OSs at one time. You get to overcome problems inherent to any one OS. So I'm a sysadmin from way back. I do see dead OSs. I see them all the time from the beginning days all the way up to now. A vendor comes along and says, this version's expired, can't use it anymore, no more security updates or whatever. Turns out with virtualization, we can reuse those old OSs and get some money back. So we're going to try to put them to work in this presentation, show you how to do all that. Again, this is an explanation of what we can do with those old OSs. They're really execution engines. You could say that they have security troubles or whatever, but when we stick them in a VM, they're reusable. They're ready to go. They're not going to have security issues because that's provided at a different layer up top with your host OS. Plus, we get to play with the old stuff again and call it work. That's always a bonus. So what's changed with all this? It's the hardware. These things have gotten so powerful that all these CPUs are now multi-core. There's gobs of RAM. There's SSDs. This stuff is fast. So in my case, I went out onto eBay during COVID or whatnot and just picked up an old Dell Precision laptop, a couple $100, and it's got an i7 multi-cores, it's got 32 gigs of RAM, and it's got an SSD built into it. This thing is fast, and it can run all our virtualized OSs just as fast. So everything is great in the hardware department. On the software side, virtualization has really increased incredibly. There's type 1s and type 2 virtualization packages. ESXi is a type 1. Hyper-V is kind of a type 1, but it's what I call a fat one, where Microsoft kind of takes it and sticks it all over in the OS and buries it, and it's hard to separate it out. Type 2s I like a little better. They're cleaner. We have Workstation or we have VirtualBox. It's very easy to install them and uninstall them and do whatever you want with them. And then, of course, not quite in the virtualization category, we have emulators, QEMU and various others. They all run on our modern DT-LT laptops, our desktops and laptops. And there's just really little to no hardware issues these days when you have all this virtualization software and these new tablets. So we now have a paradigm shift here. Given the powerful hardware and the powerful virtualization software, we can take any 64-bit OS, run it at the host OS level, the top thing controlling the piece of hardware. All our modern services, networking file system, x64, etc., delivered through that host OS are available to the virtualization software and thus to any VM running down below, as long as we have that critical guest additions in there. So what we want at the top on the controlling OS or the host OS level is a lean and mean operating system of your choice. Right now, the two that I guess are at the top of the list for everybody is a 64-bit version of Windows or a 64-bit version of Linux. There's 1,000,001 distros for Linux. Linux itself can be made lean and mean already, or you can actually just go get a distro. Let's say it's a server version. It's already running pretty lean and mean. Windows, believe it or not, at the 10 and 11 Pro and Enterprise level, we can make it lean and mean as well. And by that I mean Microsoft's not doing things to us. We go in there and we strip out a whole bunch of bad crap, and we use certain tools to do that with. AME is the package from some very smart folks that's called Ameliorated. And what they do is they go all through that OS that you put on your laptop or your desktop, Windows 10 or 11, and they strip out a bunch of bad crap. They're stripping out OneDrive, they're stripping out Defender, they're doing whatever. You have to come back and do your own thing to it, like I run ESET as my security software and antivirus and all that kind of stuff. WAU Manager is a package that lets you turn off Windows updates, and then you control how you're updating that machine via WAU Manager. So I can take a Windows package and make it just as lean and mean as the Linux distro. So both these host OSs are suitable. It's your choice as to which one you want to use. There's nothing technical in the way for you. All this leads to possibilities and combinations. We can now take any virtualized OS with guest additions, and we can overcome most technical issues that OS might have. So if you think of it as a 32-bit OS, a lot of its difficulties can be bypassed these days with virtualization, with the fancy hardware. That means we hopefully will not be having networking troubles, including Wi-Fi or anything else, because that's offered up here at the host OS level, delivered down to that guest OS in the VM. File systems, not a problem, because our guest editions in any OS allows you to use any underlying file system, whether it's NTFS on the Windows side or something else on the Linux side. There's 1,000,001 file systems over there for that. Memory address space. If we have a 32-bit guest OS, we're pretty much at a 4 gig address space. We don't have that issue anymore when we run our guest OSs in a VM, because now we can start to have multiple VMs running side by side, each one offering 4 gigs of space. 64-bit apps, that's kind of a tough one if you have a 32-bit OS and its fitness architecture is 32 bits. But it turns out, with virtualization, we can get around that as well. And I'll show you that a little later as well. So, there were so many possibilities and combinations that we now need what I call the 3 laws of virtualization. Basically, once we virtualize an OS and get it down into a guest machine or a VM, all the features of it become exploitable. The second rule is, bitness doesn't really matter when we want to exploit anything in any OS through virtualization. And the third one is, virtualized exploitation is enabled in all dimensions. That's kind of hard to picture without a good graphic, but think of it as the host OS up top, all your guest VMs down below that, and even inside a guest VM, you could have nested virtualization. So you're really going up and down and sideways and all this, and it just, it works. So these 3 basic laws and their corollaries resolve most, if not all, of the we just can't get that done scenarios. Okay? Let's go into it a little bit more detail. The first law, once virtualized, all features become exploitable. You can have a 64-bit OS next to a 32-bit OS, and you can get at everything on one machine. This is all, again, running on one machine. 64-bit processing of files. Turns out that each VM, through its guest editions, gets access to the file system offered by the host OS. So now we can do 64-bit things, if you will, to the files that are coming down from that guest VM, even though it's a 32-bit or a 16-bit or even an 8-bit. Doesn't matter. We can get at everything. 64-bit apps. 32-bit OSs don't run those, but it turns out with just a little bit of magic, you're already doing that with your RDPs and your VNCs, and you're getting an entire desktop delivered to your guest OS. We can now deliver a single 64-bit app in a frame on your OS2 PM desktop. Okay, and I'm going to show you that magic a little bit later on as well. That's the first law. Second law is kind of a recap of what I just said. 32-bit OSs can run 64-bit apps. Here's the other side of that coin. Your 64-bit OSs can still access older bit OSs and applications. In the newer versions of Windows, they kind of took away a lot of 16-bit stuff. They don't really give you the ability to run those things anymore. Turns out we can just stick everything we need in a VM and access it that way. So it goes both ways. And that third law, again, I explained that we can reach up into the host OS or down into the VMs, and they can all be nested. I'm not really going to show a demo on that because there's 20 million demos on how to nest within a VM. So let's get to some examples here. Let's say you have a 32-bit OS with 4 gigs of RAM. All you need to do to double that is get 2 PMs running side by side in their own VMs. And now you have 4 gigs for this one, 4 gigs for that one. Might be a little weird to the way you operate. You're used to having everything running in one OS. But what you can have is all your Office apps, for example, running in this VM. All your development apps running in that VM. And all of a sudden you've doubled your space. You also made this guy very happy because now you're using 2 licenses instead of 1. So, and then I also said that you can run a 64-bit app on that 32-bit OS. We're going to use a package called WinFlector. It's a product out of Poland. It's a real nice product. It lets us reflect, and that's why it's called Reflector, or WinFlector, reflect that 64-bit app running on the host OS or any 64-bit VM over to any other VM that can display that with a client, the client package. Not too dissimilar from RDP or VNC, but this stuff works. So on our OS2 desktop, we don't normally have a lot of these fancy clients, and it takes a lot of developers doing a lot of hard work to program some clients for us, but WinFlector has a package that works with an HTML5 browser. If you have that much of the product inside your browser, and we do have a Firefox and various other browsers coming online, we can now run a WinFlector app on that PM desktop and get it our 64-bit apps. We didn't have to bring an entire desktop over, and we don't have to go hunting pecking for that one 64-bit app. We're gonna see it running in WinFlector in its own window on the OS2 desktop. We talked about file systems already. OS2 has its file systems, but because we have a controlling OS above, either Windows or Linux, we can get at NTFS. If you start to think about these things, that means we can back up a lot of stuff using other OS tools, not just whatever we can get inside of an OS2 PM environment. Same thing if it's a Linux host OS. There's all kinds of file systems, all kinds of tools to back that stuff up. Same thing for security. You can run antivirus on all that at a different level and not worry about an antivirus product in OS2 that is not quite keeping up to date with all its updates, and you just can't get them anymore. It's not entirely true. There's some good people working on that problem as well. No device driver for a networking need. It's not really an issue for us because at the host OS level, we get at all our Wi-Fi and any other kind of networking environment. As long as there's guest additions for the VM, that percolates down to the VM level. Okay? So, show me the money. Does this stuff really work? Let's find out. Let's see if we can get some 64-bit apps up and running on our OS2 PM desktop. I'm going to pick OS2 ArcaOS 5.1. I'm going to launch Firefox. I'm going to go to my WinFlector site, log in. Not too much different from an RDP or a VNC session. I'm going to pick an application. In this case, I've set up 64-bit Notepad, Notepad++. And on my PM desktop, if the demo gods are smiling on me, I have 64-bit Notepad++ running in an OS2 PM window. I can minimize it, I can do whatever I want with it. You can do that with any 64-bit app. You can do it with any app that runs in the host OS of your environment. I see a hand back there.
So, curious question. What web server is he using in the background?
He's not using a web server. He's using the WinFlector software.
No, but the WinFlector is using a web server.
I'm using a browser. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
This is Firefox running on OS2.
Okay, but somewhere in the background, because you're using the browser, there's a web server running.
So if you're going to get down to that level, it's the magic built inside of WinFlector.
That's fine. Okay, that's cool. I just brought it up, and this is very interesting.
So here's the WinFlector software, and you can see that it offers its services over both TCP and web. So that is the answer to your question. The web server's built inside of the WinFlector piece.
All right.
Polish guys are great. They really built a great product. It doesn't use RDP protocol. It uses their own native TCP/IP protocol programming. It's all black magic to me. But it works, and it lets me get a 64-bit app in its own window directly on OS2, ArcaOS. So there it is, our 64-bit app. You can add any 64-bit app to WinFlector and serve it up in its own window under OS2. All right, so here's at the same time the other two demos. If I wanted to get around that 4 gig address space, I have two ArcaOSs running, which I've licensed. I have a 508 version and I have a 510 version. So I've got two VMs running. I have double the amount of address space, all on this inexpensive piece of hardware laptop with multi-core CPUs. Each one of my OS2s are running 2 CPUs, and they have that 4 gig address space. And if you look at the host OS level with both of those VMs running, and I actually have some other VMs running as well. Do I have Task Manager showing?
Yeah.
I thought I had it. There it is. So I'm using at the moment 14 gigs of RAM out of my 32. CPU is kind of just idling along, doesn't really do much. The good news is I'm finally getting some more efficiency out of my CPU. Normally these things sit idle and wait for you to push a button. Now I've got multiple VMs running, all doing things in the background, all using more resources of that CPU and memory. And that's a good thing. Some other demos, if I wanted to get at that same Notepad, I'm running this Notepad, which is the 64-bit version, on, of all things, Windows XP. Here's a Windows XP build. It's kind of old and ancient, but it serves the purpose of demonstrating we can run it as an execution engine. I've got a license for it. Many of you probably have licenses for this old software sitting in a file somewhere. It's going to waste. You're probably going to chunk it out soon and not get any value out of it. This lets you get value back out of it. Okay, so don't throw away those old licenses. Hang on to them. We can build a VM from that old OS and use it as an execution engine. It's still protected by the host OS up above. We don't need to update it anymore because all it's doing is executing things for us. Okay? So we're making money. Let's see, in my slide, I've demonstrated 64-bit apps. We could have done a SIG check on those, the System Terminal tool, to verify that it's a 64-bit. I hope you'll trust me for now. I've already shown you that we can double the RAM address space. And a lot of times when we're looking out in our OS2 World forum, we see posts of, man, I can't do this thing, whatever this thing is.
WordStar.
WordStar. So
Yeah,
here's
I run
WordStar. You cannot get WordStar running in your current environment.
We will not run in 64-bit.
What will it run in? The
It will run
VM running the exact same set of
It'll run in
software
OS2, it'll
that
run in
WordStar used way back then.
Yep.
If you're telling me I need an old DOS Win environment, we can build a VM that does that. It runs WordStar. We may have a bit of an issue if that old VM doesn't have guest access space or guest editions software to get at the file system. But at the very least, you can run that VM and take your software and keep editing it, or excuse me, not software, your files, and keep editing them and get at them.
I was going to ask you about that. I'll raise some details.
Well, it also turns out that there's way more smart people out there in the world than we really know about. They have software that lets me get at the file systems that I would normally get to through the guest editions. We can add it to a DOS and Windows machine, and you can now get at the same set of files that we can get to in other VMs or from the host OS. So that is a problem from OS2 World solved by this virtualization software. You cannot show me a program where we can't build a VM that matched that program at its point in time in history. And that means if I can run it in a VM, it's running on the exact same machine that all my other stuff is running on. I have access to it in one way or another. Can't do Wi-Fi, no device drivers, maybe some kinky hardware is being used. That's okay. The host OS, it's a modern host OS. It's running with modern hardware and it can get at everything. And through guest editions, it's going to share that back down to the VMs. So I believe that there's no scenario you can show me where we can't do something at the host OS level and get that access down to the VM level. And of course, that leads me to a challenge. From your OS2 World forums, pick something that you can't do, and I would say that we can probably solve it with virtualization with a VM. You probably can't read my fine print, but I always try to leave myself an escape hatch here, just in case someone does trip me up. But there's a challenge for you. This is something that I talked about already. This is, I think, a very key thing. You have a lot of old software, a lot of old OSs. We can bring all those back to life. So even though I see dead OSs, I'm bringing them back to life and I'm putting them to work again, and you can as well.
This is a very nasty one, I know you cannot fix.
Again, that's why I left myself an escape hatch, but what is the nasty one?
And this is something that no virtualization has happened to other platforms as well. There are still customers out there running machines from the United States with data card 9,000 machines.
Hardware.
Yes, hardware.
So they have an old piece of hardware that they have a piece of...
It's a data card machine with all that makes the credit cards. And there's an OS2 machine that's in there. And the problem is, it doesn't have a PCI card, it has an ISA card in it. Now I don't know if VirtualBox has PCI pass-through, but ISA cards, forget it. So that's one of those cases where you're good. But I also know that there's some old legacy stuff with NT where you have an ISA card, and then you can't, some VMs have PCI pass-through where you can do a pass-through from the PCI slot to the VM.
And so,
you're stuck.
so when you discuss hardware, there is some hardware out there that we just don't have virtualization for. We're trying to virtualize a piece of hardware and it's just never gonna happen, right? I'm talking about software.
Yeah, okay.
If we're doing anything in software, I can build you an environment that matches the way that software was when it was produced in 1995, okay? Hardware you could trip me up on, but that's a different subject. I'm saying for any old software, we can build it and put it in a VM and get it up and running again. So that's why my model for this stuff is going to be obsolete this, and don't look too closely at this hand. Basically, we can reuse it. But you're right, that hardware is an issue for us, and I don't have an answer there other than there's a bunch of smart people out there in the world. If there was a need to get that hardware back up and running again, they might be able to come up with an answer for it. That finishes my presentation. Basically, you have a toolbox. You have all kinds of hardware and virtualization that you can put in it. You can pull it out and solve a problem with it. I just want everybody to keep that in mind. I don't have any idea how you're going to use these tools, or you may not use them. You may like your OS2 running on one laptop. But the possibilities and opportunities are here. This is where I get into a bunch of weird stuff, and we won't really go too far down into it. I'm just going to flash through real fast. One of the things I use my hardware and virtualization for is to go try to figure out very old stuff. In one case, it's the Workplace OS. What's so interesting about that guy? It was a microkernel kind of operating system. I don't remember if they produced in the labs a 64-bit version of it. I know they had a 32-bit version up and running. I never got the opportunity to bring that into the environment that I worked in way back then, but I really wanted to. Some other things I want to do, and I don't know if I'm going to get there yet or not, is PowerShell for OS2. We have Rex. Why do we want PowerShell? Army of people out there with PowerShell knowledge. PowerShell is being produced for Windows, and they've extended it to Linux. Maybe we can get this thing up and running on OS2. I don't know. One of the things that I want to explore, and that's why it's in my cabinet of curiosities. Mainframe processing. Turns out some very smart people have emulated 7094 mainframe. I don't know what I can do with it. I can run it, I can get it up and running, but can I make use of it in my other VMs or anywhere at all in the system? I'd like to explore that a little further. There's 1,000,001 emulators out there. All these DOS emulators. They can all be running in a separate VM, doing exactly what they do very well, which is emulate a DOS environment from way back when. There's some other things that I want for OS2, which would help me as a sysadmin as I'm doing my thing inside a VM. .NET for OS2 because Chocolatey relies on .NET. What is Chocolatey? It's a package manager for Windows. We already have ANPM and various other tools like that. But it just turns out there's an army of knowledge out there on all these things and an army of applications built for the Chocolatey environment. It'd be nice if I could kind of reach sideways and pull some of that knowledge into OS2. What's a WeaselBox? It's basically a real brilliant piece of small board computer circuitry that helps us read software off of old diskettes. And with a little bit of your old hardware, if you can throw a Weasel device in there, you can get at a lot of the old OSs and software that's on those old floppies or whatnot. Pretty magical software and hardware. I might have briefly touched on this, we can have an OS2 cluster. If you can have 2 or more OS2 VMs running, you can start to do cluster things. It's because each VM has the exact same stuff that we used to use in the old days in the data centers to build a rack full of compute nodes. It's got CPUs, it's got RAM, it's got shared file storage. It can do cluster stuff. I don't have a cluster demonstration for you yet, so I'm working on that, but I would like to get to that point. I have some requests. Arcanoa already does a great job with ArcaOS. I would just like to ask you, because you're in a position to know how many seats or licenses or whatnot of ArcaOS we've produced, as well as Ecom Station, as well as older OS2 versions than that. Maybe we can talk the WinFlector folks into taking their 32-bit Linux client and turning it into a PM or an ArcaOS client for WinFlector. That means instead of having I'm not going to go show you. Instead of having the 64-bit app show up in a browser, it would show up in a frameless window because of that client. We just need them to basically do that porting for us. It's their private source code. I don't know if they would turn it over to any of the other developers that know how to do that. But I think we should give them a free ArcaOS license. I'd even be willing to pay for it. You just transfer it to them. Somebody that's much smarter than I am would figure out the development environment so that they can do that porting work. And we'd have a pretty useful tool for the rest of the OS2 world. You already do this, but please just make sure that ArcaOS runs well in a VM. Make sure that we keep working on the guest editions. As a question, I didn't know if we had tech evangelists in all region for ArcNoa.
In all regions?
And you don't have to answer this now. I'm not here to put you on the spot. I don't really hear a lot about ArcaOS. I know about it, but I want everybody to know about it. And I think we need more people out there pounding the drum for it.
Okay.
Can the OS2 world folks create a dedicated virtualization category for us? Because right now, when we talk about virtualization in any form or fashion, it gets stuck in some other subcategory underneath, and then you kind of start to lose everything.
Yeah.
If we had it all centralized, maybe it would help spread the message on what we can do with this stuff.
Yeah, that can
Like
be
you've
easy on
got
the forum.
Gaming on the OS2 world side, you can have a section for virtualization.
Yeah, it can be on the forum especially.
And that's a wrap. Questions?
Can you go back 3 or 4 slides to the,
Not if there's a problem.
Only
3 or
a
4 slides.
question.
1, 2, 3, 4.
the one about contacting the WinFlector people they haven't.
Oh, that was the request.
Okay. So, if you had a browser that had no frame on it, wouldn't that be the same as what you're asking?
It'd get close because instead of a dedicated, highly tuned client like they have for their other platforms, for Windows, for 32-bit and 64-bit Linux, that client is very small, highly tuned, and all it does is just serve up that 64-bit app for you.
I would imagine that
When
the
I do
client
this-
performs better
Yes.
than the browser
Yes.
HTML5 interface.
Okay.
So we can kind of think that they gave us the HTML5 browser piece as a solution to, we don't have a client for your platform, but do it this way. And it works.
Mm-hmm.
So that's great. We're getting access to 64-bit apps in one window. It would be even better if they had an OS2 client. And because they have some Linux clients, the porting effort, from my understanding, may not be that hard. I think they just need a little bit of help. Go
When
ahead.
you were running that Notepad++, when you open a file in it, is it local or what's going on?
Local
there?
to the shared file system that all the VMs share through their guest edition software. So if I, for example, make the Z drive shared through guest editions pointing at some file space on my Windows or NTFS file system, all the VMs can see that. So that's how you get around, not having the software buried down in the VM.
So it's rendering the user interface in the virtual machine, that's what it's doing.
It's reflecting
Right.
the rendering that's done on the host OS serving up WinFlector. WinFlector currently is free for up to 2 users. The Polish folks that did this software offered that up, and it just makes it easy for you to go test this. So you can't really do a whole lot with just 2 users. It doesn't work well in a commercial environment. They're hoping you go buy more licenses. I love these guys, and I would ask y'all to support them as well. Test it all out, but then figure out how to make use of it and go get some licenses from them. And if there's anything we can do to help them build specifically that OS2 client, that would be great. I'm willing to help out. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
I have 2 questions. One quick one, which I invite everybody to respond to, and then another more technical question. So the first question is, I only use machines which have track points.
Okay.
So can anybody here recommend recent ThinkPads with track points which can go up to 16 or 32 for the RAM? Because I'm kind of stuck at machines which can only take 4. So just give me some
T590.
What is it?
ThinkPad T590.
T59. What kind of keypad is it got? That's good.
It's chiclet keys. The last
Oh.
ThinkPad that had a real keyboard was a T520.
T520. How much memory can that take?
Which,
This has 8 in it right now.
Yeah, so 8, you could maybe put 2 virtual machines in.
I don't know if that's the max, that's just what I have.
Are you saying it's the track point?
Yeah, I'm just
That is
using
driving
the
your
trackers.
need?
I never use a mouse.
Okay, so if we had our track point moved up a level to the controlling host OS side, you shouldn't have to worry about it in your VMs. It's the
No, I just-
host
I just wanna
OS.
see-
he's talking about just a machine that's got a track point on
Okay,
it.
so
That's
that's different
capable of
from this.
handling a lot of memory for all these VMs, because the one common factor is he's still gonna be typing on the same input device.
So are you gonna run OS2 as the host OS for that machine?
I don't care, I just interested in the hardware. What is a machine that'll take a lot of memory, that's sort of a ThinkPad or a Lenovo machine?
ThinkPad
Oh, yeah, there's a zillion
buy it,
opportunities.
yeah.
Okay, so the second
You
question,
can buy
Okay.
that keyboard from Lenovo.
Yeah, and you can buy a standalone track point keyboard.
what machine is this?
That's a E585.
May I type on the keyboard?
Yeah, go ahead.
No, you may not.
That keyboard is okay.
You can only use a track point, not the keys.
That's right.
I'm going to try and install 5.1 on, I got issues, we'll talk about later on my next one up, which is the E595. And,
It's got the same keyboard?
yeah, it does, yeah.
So that's okay.
But this is, they're talking about, I think it's 32 gigs of RAM.
32 gig, yeah, 32 gigs, 64 gigs.
So the second question is, when I saw WordStar, I they're all extinct. I'm the only 80-year-old WordStar user left.
No, actually, I use it as well.
You do? Okay.
Only
I'm
because
gonna do it.
I can get it
But
up
you're
and
not
running. I
Yeah.
can get it up and running in an old VM.
I got
I ran
30 years of
WordPerfect,
filing,
I ran
40 years of
WordStar.
files in WordStar, and all right, I'll look at them. But somebody gave me a Windows 7 64-bit machine. He just got it. He lost the job. He gave it to me. So I got to run WordStar. But so you install WordStar, it won't run. It says it's got 16-bit code in it.
Yep.
It won't run. So then I talked to my Russian programmer who helps me on my machines, and he said, although he claims he's an Armenian now, he's not a Russian anymore. I used to be a talking point, a Russian computer programmer. So he said, oh yeah, you just use the virtualization tool, which actually comes with Windows 7, but I could never get the file system to talk to one another. I had to abandon the project. So I'm very interested. I hope, is there more to this? I want to do this.
At this level, you can do the type of virtualization I'm talking about. At that level of what he suggested, you're actually using a very old piece of virtualization software built into Windows 7.
Yeah, that's right. That's the one. So there's better things than that now?
Well, we just don't need to do it that way. You can do it this way,
Yeah, okay.
which is have a nice modern host OS with the virtualization software of VMware or VirtualBox, and then build your VM with exactly the OS that WordStar needed. It might be XP, it might be as far back as a DOS and Windows 3.1.
I want to see the
I don't
booklet
know.
version of this presentation now, which will tell me how to do all those things. I'm going to do It's a wonderful idea. I'm glad that you came here, you mentioned Warpstock. You know, I finally sound,
Well, it turns out, again, there's way more smart people out there on the internet. You can go out and find a VM that's probably pre-built with the DOS and Windows and the WordStar combination that you need. You don't have to wait for me.
Jeff was nodding off after lunch until you said WordStar. That's
So I
oh,
brought
that's,
him back to life.
that's like the after lunch coffee.
That's really it. I hope to have more for you next year.
Terrific.
Thank you.
Terrific. Yeah, thank you very much.